So we just started the recording, so you need to get rid of that little thing on your screen. This particular lesson, now, even the way it starts is really not, if you looked at the reference for the day, and then you looked at this lesson and you go like, well, that's not in there. That little bit at the beginning, in the synagogue at Nazareth, Jesus read from the book of the prophet Isaiah. Now, the editors of the lectionary stuck that in there. That's not the scripture. They stuck that in there to summarize what we heard last week. Because if you remember, we heard last week that wonderful lesson from Luke that we hear at St. Luke's every Feast of St. Luke, every year, where Jesus goes to the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to do the reading. The attendant hands him the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. He finds the passage, he reads it. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, et cetera, et cetera. And then he sits down and he says, then they requote that in this particular lesson appointed for this day. Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. Now, that's where last week's lesson ended, so that we could get this vision that, oh, Jesus is in his hometown and he's reading and he's instructing the people, and they're really loving him for it. Well, we know from now continuing on in the rest of that chapter that the focus changes rather quickly. Yes, they were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. And then they said to him, now we heard that you did wonderful things up in Capernaum. Do some of that for us, please. And then he goes into this thing about no prophet is accepted in his hometown. And all of a sudden, their attitude changes. They go from being amazed at his gracious words to being so angry with him that they want to throw him off the edge of the cliff. Now, last week, we looked at that a little bit from the point of view of sort of the chutzpah that Jesus might have had at the time when he's saying, I am the anointed one, because we went through the whole thing of that's how kings became kings, that they were the ones who were anointed of God. And that the tasks that Jesus outlines, preaching good news to the poor, bringing sight to the blind, releasing captives, setting prisoners free, those were all the prerogatives of the king. So he says, now this has been fulfilled in your hearing. Now, some people are going to be, okay, great, that's good. You're going to be the new king. But remember that the Messiah, the king that people in Israel at the time of Jesus were looking for, was not a spiritual reality. It was a political reality. But the king, you see, had powers. If you ever saw the Netflix series, The Tudors, there was a scene in that toward the end of the series where King Henry, I think it's the Duke of Suffolk, is one of his closest advisors and dearest friends, been with him all through his reign. And he has become very ill. And Henry summons him to the palace, and he sort of hobbles in, and Henry actually goes to him and lays his hands on him and prays for him and seeks to heal him. This healing power was ascribed to the kings. It wasn't just to be the political ruler in a country, but the king was the very that's the whole anointing thing. It had the very power of God, not only to rule, but also to heal and to sanctify, to make holy. So that's why the king had to be of superlative virtue. And when they weren't, people recognize that. But those that were, we see them in the canon of saints, don't we? On Christmas time, we sing about good King Wenceslas looked out on the feast of Stephen. He was one of those kinds of kings. We have in our windows in St. Luke's, for example, in the upper vestibule for the in the elevator lobby, King or Queen Hedwig. You know that there are kings and queens that actually met that criteria of superlative virtue, and so they're seen in the canon of saints. So this idea of royal power is what is the plenipotentiary? That's the fancy schmancy word. That's actually what diplomats get. When an ambassador is a delegate plenipotentiary, it means he has all the power of the king as he's speaking to this foreign country. So that's the kind of power that the king had relative to his relationship to God. And so in history, for example, and I go back to that Tudor period because there's so much of it is right there, and that's just around the time of the Renaissance. And what's happening is we're turning from this age of faith, from the Middle Ages, into the age of reason. And so we kind of lose some of that awe and mysticism around monarchy. That's why Elizabeth, for example, had such inner struggle. Elizabeth I had such inner struggle when she was confronted with the necessity from her counselors of executing Mary, Queen of Scots. And because she needs to kill an anointed queen. You see, and there's some practical things. If I can kill this queen, they can kill me, type thing. There's one part of it. But that notion of anointing was so impressed on the medieval mind that, and before that too, certainly before that, it wasn't a creature of the Middle Ages. It goes way back to ancient cultures, that the anointed king was actually an extension of deity, an extension of God. So the anointed king was God's presence. And so this notion that Jesus would say, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, he has anointed me, and then he goes on to say these things, is that he's being sort of a pretender to the throne. Now, that's not a bad thing in and of itself, because the people of Palestine at the time are looking for a deliverer. But the deliverer they're looking for is not someone who's going to deliver them from their spiritual blindness and all of that, but rather someone who's going to deliver them from the oppression of the Romans. And so they see Jesus. That's why, even though he's kind of got the chutzpah to call himself an anointed king, they're not so upset by that. It'd be nice if one of their own, but notice what they say. Is this not Joseph's? This is when their attitude begins to change. Is this not Joseph's son? He's just a carpenter's son. Well, let him prove himself. That's a very ancient principle too, that the proof of the truth of the prophet is that what the prophet speaks becomes real. So Jesus is saying these things, and so the people are saying to him now, well, okay, now do these things that you're talking about, because we heard that you were doing them up in Capernaum. And he sees where they're going with this. And he basically says, no, because you're not understanding what my mission and ministry is. My mission and ministry is not to create a new earthly monarchy, a new earthly order. It's to create a new order altogether, which is redemption. It is the kingdom of God, which is lived not from palace with divine decree or with royal decree, but rather from the inward out, from the heart out. And if our heart's in the right place, we don't need this other monarchy. That's an ancient principle too. That goes all the way back to the Torah. If you remember, going back just several months ago, we were having this reading from the choice of the kings, and when Saul became king and then David was chosen to replace Saul, the people were the ones that wanted a king. They wanted to be like the other nations around them. They were not satisfied with having this God, which they cannot see, being mediated to them through the priests of the temple and the prophets. But that wasn't enough for them. They wanted a king that they could see, and a king that could lead their armies and defeat all these other people when they threatened them. So they wanted an earthly order. God relents. He gives them Saul. Saul was a good warrior, but he wasn't a very great king. And then so God decides, and this is in the narrative, God decides to replace Saul with David. And David becomes the model king for Israel. And actually, when you look back at history, what David did was unite the tribes of Israel. They were divided into two basic groups, what they call the kingdom of the north and the kingdom of the south. So there was Israel and Judah, and he puts the two together, and that forms the kingdom. And then Solomon, his son, actually expands that into quite an empire, actually. Israel was quite the global force to be reckoned with. In some ways, it was kind of like Britain back in the day, where, it's this tiny little island, but they had global influence. That was what was happening in Israel at the time. Israel had what was not very large in territory, and even during the imperial period, it did get a slight bit bigger, but it had an outsized global influence. So it was really seen, and that's when money kept pouring into Jerusalem, and Solomon solidified all of these treaties by taking multiple wives, which was permitted at the time. That's how you solidified a treaty, because after all, now you're part of the family, you see. So it's this notion, we talk about the family of nations. Well, that actually has roots back then in that kind of thinking, where you married someone to be at peace with that country. Even again in the Tudor period and beyond, royal marriages were matches. They were, people were betrothed when they were infants. They didn't make their own decisions about that. This was done in order to solidify a truce with France, or an arrangement between one German state and another. And the idea is, if you meld the royal families together, they won't be at war with each other. Well, we know that all fell apart in the world order in World War I, because they were all related. They were all, children and grandchildren of Victoria, or not, of Queen Victoria. And you had cousins fighting each other. So that was the end of that idea. But it took all the way into the 20th century for that to disappear. So that this is not a new idea. And so this is the background of when Luke is telling us this story. So now that's the kind of kingship that the people are looking for. And Jesus is now beginning to tell them, that's not what I'm here for. And so they're saying, well, then what are you here for? And suddenly they begin to, when he says, no, I'm not going to do this stuff, because you do that and you're going to believe me for the wrong reasons. And so then what happens is he starts this little sermonette, which actually is in many ways quite insulting. If you look at it carefully, because there's people mentioned there, and unless we know the history of those people, we're not hearing what the people that listened to Jesus heard. For example, when Elijah went to the widow, she was the widow of Zarephath. She was a Gentile. And so he's saying, even back then, God would say, I'm going to take care of the other, rather than my people, because my people are not being faithful to me. So I'm going to show them by being generous and gracious to the other. Same thing, even more so when we talk about Naaman the Syrian. What we don't know, what we don't see is we have to go back into the Old Testament and see the character Naaman. Naaman is considered a military leader, mighty in war. But he's a Syrian, which is the enemy of Israel. Not only today, I mean, back then, the Syrian Empire was quite always threatening Israel's existence. So that when we say that Naaman was cured, even though there were many lepers in Israel, Jesus is saying, and who was cured? Naaman the Syrian. What also is not told is that because of this cure, Naaman acknowledges the God of Israel. And because even though he was not an ethnic Jew, he couldn't become part of the chosen people that way. He acknowledged and honored the God of Israel. So this is what's going on. And, Jesus is recalling these stories, which they would have known well. And he's saying to them, when the widow was practically on death's door, she had nothing to eat and her child was going to die, God intervened. When Naaman was suffering leprosy, even though there were many lepers in Israel, which one, the notable leper that got cured was Naaman, the one mighty in battle and in war. And in a way, Jesus is also using that, we might surmise that Jesus is also saying to them, you see, because Naaman came to honor God, even the Gentiles see what's going on, and you can't see it. And so, so he's actually prophesying in sort of a more traditional sense of prophecy, where he's calling them out on their lack of faith. And so consequently, they're not hearing it. They don't like it. They don't like to hear that. And so they rise up as a group. And they want to hurl him. They drive him to the edge of the city where there's a precipice, and they're going to throw him down. Basically, they want to kill him. And Luke tells us, well, somehow Jesus just simply walked through the midst of them. Either, whether that's just sort of a Luke sort of picking on the divine nature of Jesus, that he could sort of avoid this problem because it wasn't his time yet, his ministry wasn't fulfilled, however we want to interpret that. So this lesson needs to be always taken in the context of the one that we read last week. So already at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, Jesus is already at odds with the traditional sense of religious faith. And that just builds. Now, there is a clue here also for us to understand the rest of the Gospel of Luke. Because Luke was written primarily for Greek converts. So that what we see then is Luke beginning to talk about the other, the Gentile, the outsider, the one who's not part of the family, the one who's not part of the club, and that God's grace is there for them as well. Again, go back to the stories that we heard around Christmas time, particularly the one we'll hear again on February 2nd, on that prayer book feast day, which is the presentation of Jesus in the temple. And the Canticle of Simeon, which we say at Compline every night, where he talks about, mine eyes have seen the promise. So now send your servant away in peace. I'm old, I'm tired, I want to die. That's what Simeon is saying. Because now the glory of Israel has been seen in this little tiny child, a light to the Gentiles. But that's not new with Simeon, you see, because that was the purpose of Israel from the get-go. All the way back to the Torah, we see this notion that God chose a people not because they were special, but he simply chose that people because they had some special people in them, Abraham particularly. And he promises that he will use Abraham and his progeny, in other words, the nation that emerges from Abraham's seed, to be the beacon that calls the rest of the world into relationship with God. That is the stated purpose of the chosen people. So that from the very get-go in the Torah, Israel, the purpose, the mission of Israel is to be special in God's eyes so that God can work God's grace within them. And then others will begin to see that this God is the God of all gods, the Lord of Lords, the King of Kings, those titles then come rolling out of the Messiah, the Hallelujah chorus, or other pieces that Handel chose, Father forever, Prince of Peace, those titles that are given in Isaiah's prophecy that we read on Christmas. All of that is indicative of the mission of Israel. And what Jesus is calling out is that they are failing in their mission. They have become essentially, over the centuries, turned in on themselves. Okay? So that they have failed in seeing that they need to do not only worry about their own salvation, in a sense, we use Christian terms, their own salvation, but they need to be the instrument of salvation and redemption for the rest of the world. Luke picks up on this theme and he expands it. All through Luke's gospel, you will see Luke moving out and doing things with Gentiles. You will see Luke, who attests to Jesus' divinity at the cross? Surely this was a son of God. Who does that?
The Roman soldier.
The Roman soldier, a Gentile. Okay. So, there it is. The other piece that's there, which is relevant for most of the people in this room at the moment, is the fact that women are now integrated into this mission in a way that was never done before. This is something new. That the traditional division between men and women, Jesus starts to tear that down. And women are given primacy of place along with men. In other words, co-equal partners in the work of creation and in the work of redemption. This is Luke's understanding. So, and where does that come from? What is the second volume of Luke's gospel? Let's pull some threads together here.
The Acts.
The Acts. So, we've said that before. The gospel is only volume 1. The Acts is volume 2. And who is the principal protagonist in the story in Acts? It's not Jesus. Jesus is gone. But Paul. And Paul is the one who takes the gospel, the evangelium, the good news that Jesus says he's anointed to proclaim. He takes that and he's the one that spreads it to whom? The Gentiles. Now, interesting in the story, why Paul? And Paul says this in one of his letters. He says, I am a Jew's Jew. I was a Pharisee. I was of the tribe of Benjamin. And he gives his pedigree as to how Jewish Paul is. And he does that so that he can say, and I'm the one that's telling you that Gentiles need to come in. See, if a Gentile was making the argument, it was like, we want some of what you got.
Yeah.
But see, if Paul, the Jew's Jew, has had this experience, this conversion, this Damascus Road experience, and he was even persecuting the church, that this is all indicative of the authority that Paul has. So that now it is now finally through Paul, Luke is saying the primary fundamental mission of Israel is now being fulfilled because of Jesus. So that we get shadows of that in the narrative of the narrative of Luke's gospel. And then we get the practical side of it in Paul's missions. And in part, we might imagine that Luke's gospel was written in part to justify Paul's mission to the Gentiles. Because the mission happened before the gospels were written. Because that first generation of believers was still around. But it's Paul's letter. You get Eunice and Syncope and all the rest of them that are, we just celebrated yesterday at service, midweek service, Timothy, Titus, and Silas. Silas, otherwise known as Silvanus, was a Gentile, and Timothy was a half-breed. His mother was Jewish and his father was Greek. So, which was, that in and of itself was sort of a nasty thing, to Jewish people. So that, and this is not meant to be anti-Semitic at all. Please, I want to say that up front.
Mhm.
Luke is not being anti-Semitic here. He's seeing the mission of Jesus in this global context, as opposed to the more narrow concept of a Messiah, a political Messiah for that nation of Israel, which occupied essentially what we call today Palestine. Okay. This is all in this little set of verses here.
But probably what bothered me when I read it this morning was the fact that when you look at the pieces, Jesus is challenging the vision of God and God's people in this little town.
Yeah.
I mean, number one, they're convinced that they're special.
Yeah.
And then Jesus comes and tells them, well, yes, but there are other special people too. Oh, I'm the only one special. The other thing is, and you're telling me that this image of a God powerful enough to take me away from this miserable situation we're in, it's not going to happen because you're it.
You're it, and you're going to give it to somebody else.
And you're going to share. Yeah. I mean, when you think of it, I mean, I struggle with faith issues, and maybe I think too much, like Diana says, and I complexify issues, but faith is not easy.
No.
And we might have an image of the God who is a Santa who will solve all my problems, and then all of a sudden we find a problem that God is not solving like we want or as fast as we want to. And so we have to revise. So exactly what God is supposed to be doing here, or how am I supposed to act in this case? What is happening here? And so there's a big challenge. I cannot imagine, after working with people who do not have much, breaking their idea of a super God who thinks they're special. I mean, I wouldn't like it neither to begin with.
Right.
Maybe later, but at first glance,
No.
wait a minute. There's something wrong with this picture.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I don't blame them for trying to kill Jesus. Because really, when you put it in those terms, when you think of it, come on.
And there you
You're
have it.
breaking my life here.
Yes, precisely. And that's precisely it. What Jesus is doing is breaking their worldview to little pieces. And isn't that, when we talk about spirituality, isn't that the process of conversion? The life as we knew it no longer works. And so what we do is we look for deliverance. And what actually is the process of conversion is when we find the deliverance is not in the place we thought it would be. That it's in the life of the spirit, the life of the heart. You know, in that sense, I remember early in my life where I would say it this way now, but I wouldn't have been said at that time. We're poor. We don't have a lot of means compared to a lot of other people, but we're happy. Because the idea was that the important things in our life came from within. The love of our family, you know, the celebrations that we do, the care and concern, that it wasn't the outside things. And that's frequently, sometimes I think I had a spiritual director that said this to me once, that the poor can have the capacity for happiness. And when we talk about the Beatitudes, for example, the poor have the capacity to be happy in much greater degree than the rich, because the rich become worried about their riches. And didn't Jesus say that to the, you know, after the parable of the story of the rich young man, rather not the parable, but the story of the rich young man, it is more difficult for a camel to pass through the needle's eye than it is for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of heaven, because all of our energy is going into this world that we've built up around ourselves. And little of that energy is going into the development of the soul. So in that sense, poor people, I'm not saying we should make everybody poverty stricken. I'm not talking about poverty. What I'm talking about is people who don't have a lot of things, or, you know, that basically they have a home, and they have the basics of life. And when we don't have the basics of life, that becomes our problem, our responsibility, particularly if we have more than the basics of life. I know that sounds very socialistic and very communistic, but it's very Christian. It goes back to Acts 2, you know, that's a fundamental perspective of Christianity, which leads me then to the next step in all of this. Now, thinking of what we just all said and heard, aren't we the same way? Aren't we always worried about what we already have and preserving it? What about if somebody said, I'm going to take what I would give to you otherwise and give it to the other? We then start looking at social policy. What about our immigration laws? What about the social safety net we talk about, you know, sometimes? How many times I've heard people saying, well, I'm tired, especially more recently when all of this money had been, you know, given, or not given, but, you know, allocated, like the childcare credit and all that kind of stuff that was, you know, and the fights over that was like, I'm tired of paying all those taxes so that those people don't have to work, you know, that whole thing. It's the same thing. It's the same spiritual reality. You're taking what is justifiably mine. I earned it. I worked for it. I'm special. And you're taking it from me to give to them. It's the whole dynamic that and this is fundamentally human, which means it's part of our sinfulness that often emerges in different ways. In Jesus' time, it emerged in the way we just described. In our own day, it emerges in a different way. We're not looking for a political messiah, or are we? You know, when someone says, I will take care of you. Wow. Those votes rack up real fast. And then what happens is the reality of it starts to strike.
Yeah. But when you were talking about poverty, not poverty of the body, the lack of a roof or food or whatever, but there's a poverty among, and I'm making a blanket statement here, and I don't want to be too general, but among some people, their poverty is a spiritual poverty because they think that they need more cars, more money in the bank, more of this, more of that, and then I'll be happy, and then I'll be satisfied, and then they're always unhappy. I mean, they will not say they're unhappy, but at the core, they're unhappy because they have not realized a spiritual goal, just a material goal. And you know, people who have and give away among the very wealthy, I'm thinking about, must in consequence feel a much more satisfied spirit because they've shared.
Mhm.
Now we who are in the middle, and I say that advisedly, I have to keep reminding myself, I am not wealthy, but I'm one of the richest people I know,
Right.
compared to 98% of the world.
Right. When we think of ourselves in terms of our national we talk about our national interests and so on. We are the richest, most powerful, strongest, most educated nation in the world. There's no doubt about it, by every measure. And when another nation starts to approach that, don't we get nervous about it?
Yep.
It's like, well, we're not special anymore. That whole notion of American exceptionalism. Well, ancient Israel thought they were exceptional in that same way because God chose them.
Mm-hmm.
And the danger in this is when that mindset gets wedded to religion,
Mm-hmm.
as it has in various parts of evangelical Christianity. You know, so for example, you get the what I think is a corruption of the gospel in the gospel of prosperity, you know, the whole Joel Osteen kind of approach to things. That, you know, be faithful to God and God will give you more and more and more and more and more. Well, why do you want more and more and more? That seems contrary to the teachings of Jesus somehow to me, you know. So it's premised on a mistake.
You have to define the more.
Yeah.
Does not
Well,
mean
they're talking
it is.
about they're talking about the shekels, you know. They're talking about the big house, just what you said, the big house, the cars, the money in the bank, you know, that kind of stuff.
But if you gain more in many ways, spiritually, financially, whatever, then you should also acknowledge a responsibility to use that.
Yes.
Because you've been blessed through nothing of, I mean, how did I end up where I ended up? I mean, it was a matter of an upbringing, a lot of luck, which I reflect on and say, no, that was the hand of God guiding.
Mm-hmm.
You know, now I lost my train of thought, so I will stop.
Okay. Well, let me throw something in there too, because then, you know, it's easy for us to cast stones at the upper echelons of society. But how do we come by our lifestyle? For example, when we look at the fact that a working class family can have this, 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 and this, and this at such an inexpensive price, because it is being made in sweatshops in a faraway place where people are working in almost near inhumane conditions.
Sometimes even here.
Shekels. Yeah, here
Yeah.
too.
Um, I I keep thinking about my experience in the last parish I served, and I visited families where even the bathroom was used by someone to sleep. And these are families who are down the road in Pennsylvania,
Yeah.
not that many miles from us, and probably still. And I remember one family where the kids were sleeping on the floor and the parents on the bed. There was an uncle somehow accommodating in one room.
Mhm.
Everybody was sleeping, and they stayed there long enough to finish that particular crop
Mhm.
in order to move somewhere else. And what I thought was, these kids are not going to get any education worth
Right.
anything. And when we think nowadays, where so much depends on using technology, what kind of computer can a kid like that have when
Right.
they barely have enough to survive?
Right.
Those were kids who were growing up to be more of the same and to continue the pattern the parents had to survive. And I remember another family, and I mean, we were in an apartment, and each room in the apartment was used by a different group of people. And one single guy who slept in the bathroom, in the tub during the night. And what I keep thinking is that it's understandable that they look at us that are comfortable and have a house as their dream,
Mhm.
as something to achieve at some point, or at least as something they would like to have. And that for them, empowerment is part of it.
Yes.
And I still remember somebody in the congregation told me, why don't we just grab together all the different things we can have and have a party in the church? Okay. And we organized it, everybody who wanted to bring anything could bring it to eat. And we would have movies, we would have volleyball. We had a big enough property for that. And so everybody that Saturday, it was a holiday, came in. And at one point I look around and there was a group watching a video, another group doing grilling. Another group was playing volleyball. The next group was playing soccer. Another one was with a guitar, and everybody, and there was a little group around singing. And there was so much food that by the end of the day, it was 8 o'clock. I was worn out, ready to go home. And they were still playing. And I said, come on, people, I'm tired. Aren't you? But there was so much food that we have to organize several weeks to get rid of all the food they brought.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the excitement never abated. And so I thought, they're helping each other. They're having a joyful day that they probably have hard time finding anywhere in town.
Mhm.
And they feel free to be.
Yes.
And they came for more. Then it became a tradition during the summer, and I was the one who wanted to go by 8 or 9 o'clock.
But Carmen, what that points out too is the importance of community.
Yeah.
That our social fabric in our society is about individuals. But other cultures, the other that often, quote unquote, invades our space, really envisions a life which is lived in community. And that's a clash of culture and a clash of values. And when values clash, that's what we get today's gospel. Is that there's a clash of values there. And that's part of what we confront on a regular basis. I just know Vestry just did something at St. Luke's. I know I'm going to get the undertow from this. Kathy knows what I'm talking about. We just determined that we would give $20,000 to LCCM for the Fresh Start program. And that we would give $5,000 to the Stevenson School for Ministry to underwrite a course for 2 years. And then we would take the balance of this sum of money and invest it in the maintenance fund for the church. I know there are going to be people that say, well, why are you always telling us, we have to give more money if you've got that much money to give away? Soon.
We didn't come by that money from donations from the parish in the first place. They came.
True, but people are going to say, well, if you had the money, why are you asking me for money?
Well,
because we have a wider mission.
I mean, I think, of course, you have a commitment to try to individually to try to help carry out the mission of the church. And I mean,
Yeah.
I just, I mean, listening to what Carmen says, how do you keep the momentum going and what you did? And I just feel like in the past 2 years, we've kind of been locked in individualism. And I mean, we had little nuggets of that kind of activity going, but now it's been sort of pushed back. And I think this is so exciting to work with LCCM on this particular project and the Stevenson School. But there's so much that needs to be done. And I sit here, I have trouble keeping my house warm in the winter. And I had a failure of some of my heating system and I had to use my wood stove to really keep the house warm. And I'm sitting here thinking, this is the white woman's first world problem. In Afghanistan, and I didn't even have the wood to use to keep my little tent warm. There's so many problems. Shouldn't we want to share some of the what came to our church with good intentions? I mean,
Sure.
It was intended to help our church to continue running. We were able to do that, and shouldn't we share that?
Yeah.
Isn't
Well, see-
there a benevolence fund for a reason?
Well, there's this notion though that, see, again, that just kind of rips the scab off the problem in some ways. If that attitude emerges in some people, then it's showing us as a community and as individuals that we have a clash of values within, which is exactly what happened in the synagogue here, in Jesus' story, the story of Luke here, that this, some people are expecting one thing, other people are looking at something else. And it's the people who are looking at the something else that the people who are expecting one thing aren't really happy with. And so consequently, there's a clash, there's a conflict that emerges. And one would hope that everyone would see it the way you see it soon. But everybody doesn't. and that's, of course, that's my responsibility then, as pastor, is to kind of negotiate all of that.
Well, I would disagree that it's only your, I think it's everybody's
Oh, yeah.
responsibility.
Well,
That-
I'm the leader. I
Yeah,
have
well,
to set
yeah.
the tone. Yeah.
But
I have to be the Jesus figure here. They're going to hurl me over the cliff, because I'm the one who has to sign it off.
Well,
off on.
I mean, it's all of Vestry too, who
Yeah.
did that. And
Yeah.
there was not too much discussion in Vestry against it.
there was a lot of surprise when it was suggested, but then that's why when it was first suggested, just on a practical level, folks, because we have two vestry members here, experiences, basically, it came up and everybody's sort of like, whoa, whoa, whoa. But then I said, well, we're not going to decide that tonight. Let's leave it. Let's let it lay until the next time. And by the time we came back, there was unanimity. I mean, this was a unanimous decision. The only concern was how to do it rather than should we do it?
Yeah.
And that's a perfectly legitimate conversation to have. But there was almost no, in the second meeting, there was almost no pushback. The only concern was just the concern I expressed, and it was only mentioned briefly. And that was, well, what are people going to say when they realize we gave away all this money? I said, well, they're all going to know because it's all going to be explained. I mean, I just wrote an article for the newsletter. So when the newsletter comes out, it's going to be in there. There's a portion, if you've looked at the annual report, there's a little bit of it in there. That this is why we are here. We are to be, like Israel was to be the light to the nations, we are to be the witness to the mission and ministry of this Jesus we love so much. And if we don't do that, we fail.
It's also a tradition of St. Luke's to do stuff out in the community.
Oh, yeah.
And however it was, one time it was kind of like, okay, we're going to give you money so you can start a hospital because we've got money.
Right.
And now we've got a little bit of money. We're not, endowed like we used to be, but we have a duty. We have, it's a calling really.
Yeah.
To help and we live in a community that needs the help. I mean, it was at one time really a middle class community around there. It's now, I hate to say gone downhill, but
well, it's a working class community.
Yeah, yeah. And there are a lot of people who are, it's hand to mouth. They're
paycheck to paycheck,
Yeah.
it's working 3 jobs, this whole notion that, the great resignation everybody's talking about, part of what's happening is people are realizing I can't keep going this way. Because now what the pandemic did was give people, everybody hit the pause button. And suddenly they realized, what are we, crazy? Why are we doing this? Why are we wanting to have 3 cars and a big house, and all that kind of stuff? Why can't we just get by with 2 or 1 for that matter? I mean, we talk about that in our own family here, like when we get to retirement, we actually said, it'd be nice if we lived in a situation where, public transportation be available, good kind of thing like that. And we could do away with having 2 cars. What does that do? First of all, it saves us money. That's one piece. But the other piece of it is also, we can then start to look at our stewardship in other ways. Creation care. We're not adding to the carbon footprint of global warming and all that sort of thing. Beyond that, there's, we're not having traffic congestion. We have to think a little, we have to organize our lives a little bit differently so that we take 1 trip to the store, not 6, that kind of thing. Or we live near a market or something where we can walk, which is also better for us, that if we get out and exercise a bit more. There's ways of thinking of these things that actually change, again, the mindset, so that when we have a richness around us, we are less worried about sharing it with others. And the other then doesn't present the challenge that we think it does. See, that's the problem that we face, is that we may be generous in some ways, but what is our attitude toward that other? The homeless, the hungry, the marginalized, the immigrants.
And probably one of the things that I have to recognize is that even when I am an other in some ways, and that was the category I had to assume in Nashville when I was working there. I was trying to get my license, and the only options were white, black, or other. So I'm an other. But if you see my DNA, you will discover that I have from almost every country and race in the world. I mean, my brother says that I'm the United Nations, but that's another story. But while I was working probably at the highest level, and yet the church I attended was in a poor neighborhood in one of the worst places in Nashville. And it was because I wanted it to be real.
Yeah.
The sitting down with the homeless week after week during the winter time, hearing their stories kept faith real.
Yeah.
And helps you see, okay, this is not a stranger. This is a human being who, no matter what he has done, and I found stories that broke my heart.
Mhm.
Executives that all of a sudden did not have enough to survive and found themselves alone. And every time they have a step and they feel like, oh, I got myself a car, that may be the place where they have to sleep because they didn't have enough to find a place. Or we hire them to do something so that we could, and at noon, so that we could have an excuse to give him food because we were not sure if he had food. You know, those kinds of stories were real. They were not inventing it. And unless we expose ourselves intentionally to that other, we will never learn a story.
Right.
They
right.
will always be strangers.
Soon.
I think this is one of the things that troubles me is that right now we are throwing money at the problem and not necessarily ourselves. I hope that as we that we can do more. I mean, that's how free noon meal began, was when the steel mills closed and even the executives didn't have what they had had.
Yeah. Well, I hear you and I agree with you. And that's one of the things that we keep sort of ringing that bell, you know, that there will be a time, let's not get into this bad habit, but the habit's necessary now because of the pandemic. We just can't do the in-person ministry that we want to do so dearly. I mean, there are people in the parish can't wait until it starts again. But then I look at, for example, you know, who is the greeter for free noon meal? Deb Harris. Deb Harris has, you know, a list of health problems a mile long. And actually, I don't even think she was vaccinated because of them.
Probably not.
You know, so because of those health concerns, you know, but she's the one who greets everybody who comes in the door. So that, you know, we begin to see that issue. One of the things we did, with the information we're kind of getting out about Fresh Start, because now they're going to be starting over in the church across the street finally. Interesting, I talked to Dave Funk on Saturday. Some of the clients are not happy about that because they've been able to stay in hotel rooms for the last year and a half. And now they're going to go back to this sort of dormitory style, you know, when they have to go to the, you know, so you know, they're not going to have their own bathroom, you know. I get it, but you know, that's not sustainable. I mean, that's what part of this money will be used for, is to sort of help them dig out of the hole they got into. Now they've got grant money and other funding that help them sustain it, but that's not going to be there forever. I mean, now that once we start really to emerge from this, you know, that's all going to go away. So, but this in-person component is something that's a bell I keep ringing whenever I'm writing something about it. And even, I forgot which article it's in, but one of the things I wrote for this coming newsletter is money isn't enough. You know, that we need your time, we need your energy, that kind of thing, to sort of get that foundation out there again, that's really the core of ministry. Spending money on something is not ministry. It's support, it's sustenance, but it's not ministry. Ministry is the doing, and the doing needs to be sustained. I had a talk with then dean of the cathedral in Bethlehem, Tony Pompa. He's retired from there, but we had a talk once about, actually, it was when the Candy Eggs project started, the ECW, and I was telling him how wonderful it was, this cacophony of noise right next to my office, when they're just in there and they're carrying on. And he said, yeah, I kind of missed that because, at the cathedral, they have more money than God, I think, in some ways. And, they all just decided, again, vestries and committees, they're just writing checks. And they're not, and what we talked about was, in the case of like the Candy Egg project, it's not so much, that's not so much outreach ministry as it is ministry within the community, because it builds the community, it builds relationships, and you don't get that when you write checks.
Yeah.
And that, we may not give as much money, but that is a sense of accomplishment. And I remember giving a sermon not too long ago. Well, now it is long ago. I got in trouble for it in the sense that there was a lot of pushback. I don't get pushback from too many times that I preach, but this was a biggie. And from significant people, because this was the theme of it essentially. And I preach this at least once in every parish that I'm in, and sometimes a couple of times. That essentially we need to look at our own motivations for doing good. When we do good, because it makes us feel better, then it is not as valuable than actually doing it for the sake of the other. The motivation might be to help someone, but it's the kind of thing, what happens during the holidays, for example. Everybody gives to charities during the holidays. It's a major fundraising time because everybody feels generous around the holidays. But where are they in May? When the same people have the same problem. And the gift of the NGOs that, that I've been involved in and supported and so on, is that, we've developed this system where you gather all of that during that generous time of year, and then you parcel it out over the next 12 months. At least there's a system to do that. But the attitudes from a religious point of view, a spiritual point of view, is the problem is it makes me feel good to do this. And so I'm not saying that that's bad. Feeling good about it is not bad. That's why I got a lot of pushback, because they thought what I was saying was bad. No, I'm not saying that at all. But if that's the only reason you're doing it, then don't bother, because then it's about you, not about the other. It has to be about the other. The motivation and the outcome has to be about the other. Otherwise, we're just building ourselves up. Kathy.
I guess I'm going to counter that in a little way, that sometimes it's a case of cash flow type too.
Yeah.
With Bernie being self-employed, our winter months can get pretty, and towards this, when we get above water, then we could start giving out more than we've planned on. But
right.
For us, May is our tough month.
And you don't need to even think about the amounts. It's what I'm talking about in that context is the attitude, the value orientation.
I know, but I was just saying that sometimes there's a reason why you can give more in December than you can in.
Sure. No, I get that. I mean, and like I said, but we've at least developed a system that capitalizes on that generosity. But I think when we give, we have to be mindful why we give.
In addition to all we're talking about, the Episcopal Church has another problem. Throughout my lifetime, it has always been regarded in its community as where all the wealthy people went to church.
The
the
country club and prayer.
lawyers and the doctors and all the big people in town.
Yeah.
And it's the same at St. Luke's, where we have been regarded by our community as that's where all those folks go, and they give money and everything, but we're really not part of their community. And sometimes when we have put on projects that involve the neighborhood, it was like pulling teeth to get them out to be part of it, because they felt they were not part of our community.
Right.
And this is a problem. I haven't got an answer for it, but we're on the right track, I think.
Well, this process of othering happens in two directions, because it's a basic human problem. It really isn't a social problem from the point of view of the haves and the have-nots. I think that's often the lines on which it falls, but the attitudes go in both directions.
Yeah.
You know, I don't want anything with you. You people talk down to us all the time. You're too educated. You're too rich. You're too this. You're too that. Well, but we want to help. Well, why do you want to help? You know, that's why I go back to this notion of what is our motivation for doing things, because it also talks about, Carmen said something critical a little bit back. It's not about the giving. It's about empowering. You know, we can give, and it does nothing if it doesn't change their lives. It may make their lives better in the sense that they have a little bit better surroundings. They don't have to sleep in a bathtub, or at least they got a pad to put in the bathtub when they're sleeping, you know. But the reality is, the real work is in empowering people to take control of their own lives. And I don't mean that in a capitalistic way. What I mean by is that they become self-determining, that they make the decisions about their lives. Because when we give somebody something, we determine what they get. Interesting story that I like to bring up in this context sometimes. And that is the argument over SNAP, or food stamps, what we used to call food stamps. There aren't such things anymore, but you know, the program. I don't know how many times I've had people come to me and say, I resent the fact that I have to struggle for what I have, and I have to buy, you know, ground chuck and blah, blah, blah. And I see somebody going through they pull out their SNAP card and they're buying a steak. And I said, do you ever stop and think, now, how many times have you watched that person shop? Well, you know, just that one time. I said, do you think for a moment that maybe that was for a very special meal? Maybe somebody's anniversary, or somebody's birthday, or their, you know, first communion meal, or, you know, whatever, you know, I just go through the whole list of things. And that maybe that's about you know, they only do that maybe 2 or 3 times a year. The rest of the year, they're buying all this other, you know. And I'm not saying that that's always true. I know there are people who abuse the system and all that sort of thing. But it's about our attitudes again. You know, see, they have something in that food line that I wanted, and they have it and I don't. And so I resent. That's a sinful attitude. The other attitude is, oh, they're buying, I'm glad that they're able to enjoy that. See, and that's hard. That's a hard transition to make, because it's this notion, I have what I have and I want more. And I don't want them to have as much as I have, because they are using my resources to do that. See, it's okay to feed the poor as long as we don't feed them any more than we eat.
Well, in some cases, there would be a lot more obese people among the poor.
Well, actually, obesity is a problem among the poor because of the nature of what they have.
What they have, yes. Because if you want to fill up, you fill up on things that are not necessarily the healthiest things,
right,
but they make you feel full. make you feel comfortable. May I make a comment to George, what he was saying about the rich church? I mentioned earlier that the church I had belonged to in Allentown, which was St. Stephen's, when we were going to merge with Christ Lutheran, there were people in our congregation who said, oh, no, that's where the rich Lutherans go. And we were the poorer Lutherans. Oh, no. Now, you know that they used to wear spats, the ushers used to wear spats and gloves, and they had boutonnieres every Sunday. And I'm thinking, how many decades ago was that? But there were people who would not go along with the merger, who would not go to that church. And I thought, I'm going to go come hell or high water because I want to see this merger work. You can't say you're going to have a merger and then nobody merges. But the prejudice was that that was the rich church. That's where the lawyers and the doctors and, people went. Well, I found out, there are a lot of educated people in that congregation, and they're just as nice as anybody else.
Here is our participation in this mission and ministry of Jesus in the way in which we're talking about it. And I think it holds the key for us. And again, you're going to say, well, beat this dead horse some more, Father. Why don't you? On Sunday at the annual meeting, everyone will be asked this question. Will you seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourself? And the ritual answer is, I will with God's help. Will you strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being? And the answer is, I will with God's help. Those are the two final questions in our baptismal covenant. So these promises are taken by everybody who claims the name Episcopalian. And so consequently, it has to be at the very core of our attitude. And those two things about the fact that we see the divine spark in one another, and not just the people in the church, but it's every human being. And as we treat one another, and I just don't mean church family, but anybody in the world, so we are treating God, because each one of them is made in the image and the likeness of God. And that will be sort of our closing meditation a little bit on all of this. But I think it does give us then pause that we too often talk about those things and we don't really plumb what it means on a practical level. And that's what we were doing today.